Good day to owner-operators in the inshore fleet. This is a C&L podcast on the upcoming northern cod fishery, the second in a series of podcasts, or fishcasts as we call them. Everyone's mind is on the price of crab, I know. So look at the topic of northern cod as a distraction. And if one thing should be clear from the massive drop in the crab price, from $6.15 a pound at the end of last season to $2.20 a pound to start this season, with nothing in the wings to make up for that loss of income, there's one thing that should be crystal clear from the waves in the crab market. It's that we're too reliant on a single species. And I'm not saying cod will save the snow crab fishery, because it won't. But that huge reliance on snow crab, worth more than all other commercial fisheries combined in this province, is an incredible weakness that must be addressed for the good of the inshore fleet and the rural economy. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Same goes for fish. Diversification is the name of the game in terms of the wild commercial fisheries, a lesson we have yet to learn after so many fishery collapses. Newfoundland and Labrador went from fishery feast last year in 2022 and in 2021, all on the strength of a strong crab price, to fishery famine to start this season with a weak crab price. Feast to famine before a boat has even untied from the wharf, because the rise and the fall of the fishery is balanced on a single species. Mind you, there are bright spots ahead for the price of snow crab, but that's not today's topic. Given the $2.20 crab price, other commercial fisheries like northern cod will become more important, especially to small boat enterprises. First things first, you can't mention northern cod without doing the math on how many years it's been since the 2-year moratorium was announced. 31 years is the running total. 31 years since the late John Crosby shut down the fishery for 2 years. He laid off 30,000 people. It was the biggest layoff in Canadian history, although the question has been raised whether COVID-19 may have claimed that title, biggest layoff in Canadian history, the pandemic. I say the moratorium retains the title. There are 60,000 fewer Newfoundlanders and Labradorians today than in the early 1990s when the moratorium was handed down. So Newfoundland and Labrador has had a small-scale stewardship fishery for northern cod going back to 2006. A small harvest, one that's more about keeping an eye on the stock, keeping fishermen on the water. Offshore draggers are not allowed to fish northern cod, just inshore boats with individual quotas until 2016 and weekly limits after that. DFO doesn't set an actual northern cod quota. Instead, the department is careful to say that it sets a maximum authorized harvest because it's an unofficial commercial fishery. If DFO restarted a full-fledged northern cod fishery in Canadian waters with an official northern cod quota, foreign fleets might want a piece of the action outside 200 miles. And of course, that would be on top of the unofficial northern cod fishery that foreign draggers have been at for years. It's fair to say Ottawa has failed to protect migratory stocks like cod once they swim over the 200-mile limit. NAFO is useless. In terms of international trade, the federal government has let foreign nations have their way with the Newfoundland and Labrador fishery. Little off track, sorry for that. In 2022, last year, DFO set the maximum northern cod harvest at 13,000 tons. 13,000 tons also in 2021, and 13,000 tons in 2020. The northern cod harvest level has been stuck at almost 13,000 tons for 3 years running. But then it's hard to make a solid argument for a rise in the northern cod harvest when DFO's northern cod science has been so embarrassingly weak. Between broken down old Coast Guard science ships not being able to carry out offshore surveys and get the job done, to problems with new science boats coming into service, DFO hasn't followed through on an annual northern cod assessment since at least 2020. That aside, the lack of science aside, catch rates in the northern cod stewardship fishery have been good, and the union and processors, buyers, and Indigenous groups have all made recommendations on how big the northern cod harvest should be this year. So let's go through that. First, to the FFAW. The union is requesting a northern cod quota this year of 25,000 tons. That's about double last year's almost 13,000 tons. The proposal is based mostly on the strength of catches in the 13,000-ton stewardship fishery. There's no science, remember. As for the Association of Seafood Producers, ASP, they've asked for a 31% increase in northern cod removals to 17,000 tons from 13,000 tons. Then there's Labrador. In a joint proposal by the 2J fleet, that's the Labrador fleet, the Nunatuva Community Council, the Labrador Fishermen's Union Shrimp Company, the co-op, and other indigenous groups together, they're all looking for 20% of the maximum allowable harvest of northern cod, specifically for Labrador. 20% of whatever the harvest level is, 13,000 tons, 17,000 tons, or 25,000 tons. Then there's the big boat offshore sector, the big draggers. They're looking for a 300-ton northern cod allocation. But then that request isn't really taken seriously because DFO has stated in writing that the first 115,000 tons of northern cod will be reserved for the inshore fleet. But hold on. The inshore fleet and indigenous groups. DFO quietly tacked indigenous groups on a few years ago. And of course, indigenous groups may be allowed to hire the big boat offshore sector to catch their share. DFO hasn't said no to that. The option is still on the table. So to summarize, an increase to the northern cod quota is likely this year, and CNL is aboard. But the state of DFO science is shameful. It's a Canadian embarrassment. I cannot understate that. Management measures have failed to turn around northern cod and other commercial stocks. The government of Canada has failed to take action on foreign overfishing outside 200 miles. All three cod stocks adjacent to Newfoundland and Labrador are deemed by DFO to be in the critical zone, with fishing to be kept to a minimum. There's northern cod, moratorium since 1992. DFO slapped a moratorium on the Gulf cod fishery off western Newfoundland just last year, while there was talk a couple of years ago of a moratorium on the South Coast cod stock in fishing zone 3PS. That did not happen. But last year's cod quota in 3PS was only 1,300 tons, barely a commercial fishery. But back to northern cod. The landed value of northern cod last year was just over $22 million, up from $12 million in 2018. But remember, the cod fishery pales in comparison to the snow crab fishery's landed value of $758 million. Like I said, the cod fishery won't make up for losses in the crab fishery, but every little bit will help. According to DFO's most recent numbers, there were 1,240 active enterprises in the northern cod stewardship fishery last year. Now that number has been dropping like a rock, down 15% alone from 2018. The average landed value of cod last year was 81 cents a pound. The FFAW's cod quality program didn't do a whole lot for price, but then the program was suddenly, mysteriously canceled in 2020. The union still runs the Sentinel or test cod fisheries, but DFO won't release the landings. DFO says the information is confidential because the union sells the fish to fewer than 5 buyers, the so-called rule of 5. That sure sounds like an FFAW cod quota to me. And how ridiculous is that? Not releasing the information on the Sentinel fisheries, on the test fisheries. If it was up to me, there would be an independent assessment of the state of the northern cod stock. DFO has not gotten the job done, and we can't take their word for it that they will get the job done. If it was up to me, Canada would insist on a single enforcement regime for fishing inside and outside 200 miles. Portuguese and Spanish dragger fishermen laugh when they see Canadians coming. If it were up to me, seals would be factored in the northern cod assessments. The problem is, it's not up to me. This is where all Newfoundlanders and Labradorians have to come together and demand better. DFO is expected to announce the 2023 Northern Cod Management Plan by June. I'll be listening with bated breath. Thanks for your time, and that's the word today on Northern Cod.